Welcome back. In the last video, we added sound to our fire weapon function. So now we can click the left mouse button or squeeze the right trigger of our console controller and get sound. But now we'd like to add a visual component with some particle effects. Now, in order to spawn particle effects, we need a location at which to spawn them. Now on our character, you'll see that we have a gun, and we're going to want to spawn the particles at the tip of the barrel of the gun. Now we can reference a location on our skeletal mesh with the use of sockets. So we're going to add a socket to the skeleton on this skeletal mesh. So let's find the skeleton associated with our skeletal mesh. In Shooter Character BP, we can select the mesh, and here in the details panel, we can click the magnifying glass to browse to Bellica in the content browser. Now, this is her skeletal mesh, and in the same folder is the skeleton associated with the skeletal mesh. Open the skeleton. We're going to add a socket onto a bone at the gun. Now we can find the bones on the weapon by searching for weapon. And you'll see that there's a bone called weapon. If we select it, we can see that it's a bone down here on the actual gun. We're going to add a socket to the weapon bone. Right-click on weapon and add socket. We can rename it by right-clicking and selecting rename socket, and I'm going to call this barrel socket. So click the X up here, and now we can find it by searching for barrel, and we'll see barrel socket. Now let's maneuver our way down to the gun, and we'll see that barrel socket is in the location of the weapon bone. We want it to be at the tip of the barrel. So with the barrel socket selected, hit W so we can move this around. I'm going to move it forward and up so that it's just at the tip of the barrel. Now also notice on the widget for the barrel socket that the red or X-axis is pointed to the side, but we want the X-axis pointed forward. So let's rotate this by hitting the E key, and we'll rotate it by 90 degrees so we can see now that the X-axis is pointing forward. And of course, the blue or Z-axis is pointing upward. This is what we want. So let's click Save, and now that we have a socket called barrel socket on the skeleton, we're ready to add a particle system variable to our shooter character. So let's go back into Visual Studio in shootercharacter.h, and here in the private section, we'll add a new private variable. We're going to forward declare this, and it's going to be a uParticle system. So class uParticle system, it's a pointer, and we'll call it muzzle flash. Now, I'd like it to be edit anywhere, blueprint read write, category combat, and also meta allow private access true. So let's copy the uProperty macro for fire sound and use the same one for muzzle flash. While we're at it, we can add a comment for fire sound and say randomized gunshot sound cue. And for muzzle flash, our comment will say flash spawned at barrel socket. Now we'd like to spawn this particle system when we fire the weapon, and we can do that in Shooter Character's fire weapon function. So first we need to get a hold of the barrel socket, and we're going to create a local variable. We're going to make it const because we don't plan on changing this local variable, and it's going to be of type uSkeletal mesh socket. That's a pointer, and we'll call it barrel socket. Now we can get the socket from our mesh. We get the character's mesh component with get mesh. From the mesh, we can call get socket by name. And this takes a string for the socket name, and if there exists a socket on the skeleton, then this will return it. We called our socket barrel socket. So next we need to make sure barrel socket is valid, so we can make a check for barrel socket. If that's not null, then we can get the transform for the barrel socket. The transform will contain location, rotation, and scale data. So we'll create a const local variable fTransform socket transform. and we'll initialize it with barrel socket, and the uSkeletal mesh socket has a function called getSocketTransform. And getSocketTransform simply requires the mesh, which we can access with getMesh. Now we're using a skeletal mesh socket, which means we need to include the skeletal mesh socket header. Let's resort to Unreal Engine documentation and search for uSkeletal mesh socket. And here we have skeletal mesh socket, and we know that we need to include engine/skeletalmeshsocket.h. So we'll copy that and paste it here in shootercharacter.cpp, and now uSkeletalMeshSocket is recognized. Now we can spawn the particle system. Now remember, we created a particle system pointer called muzzleFlash. So we need to check to make sure we set that. If muzzleFlash. If it's valid, we can spawn the particle system using a uGameplayStatics function called spawnEmitterAtLocation. Now, spawnEmitterAtLocation needs a uWorld, which we can always get the world with getWorld. It needs a particle system, which we're going to use muzzleFlash for that. And next, we can pass in a transform. We're going to use socketTransform because that conveniently gives us a transform at the exact location with the exact rotation that we want for this particle system. So we can compile this. Now we're back in the editor in Shooter Character BP, and you'll see in the combat section we have the muzzleFlash, which is a particle system. Now what are we going to select for the particle system? Well, let's take a look at what came with Bellica. Here in Paragon Lieutenant Bellica, close the Characters folder and open the Effects folder. Click the drop-down next to Particles, and then Bellica, Abilities, Primary, and we'll find P_Bellica Muzzle. Now, if we open up the particle system, and once it finishes loading, you'll see that we get this gunshot, and this is really cool because it's got a flash, it's got smoke, it even has bullet shells flying. But if you look at this long enough, you'll see that it's actually a 3-shot burst. It's 3 quick bursts of fire, and you'll even see 3 individual bullet shells. And we only want to spawn a single burst and 1 bullet shell. So we're going to alter this a bit. But just like when we altered the animations, we're going to create a copy of this so that if we mess it up, we don't mess up the original. So close this, and up in our _game/assets folder, let's create a new folder called effects, FX. And then we'll scroll down and find our P_Bellica Muzzle particle system. Let's drag this into our new effects folder and click copy here. Now we have a copy of this. Open it up, and now we can alter this all we want, and if we mess it up, we still have the original. So how do we change this from bursting 3 times to a single burst? First, let's take a look at the first item here. Each of these sections is a different component to the particle system. The first one is called Smoke Burst, and as you would guess, this determines the smoke portion of our particle system. If we select Smoke Burst and click on the Spawn section, in the Details panel, notice we have a Burst section. Now here we see Burst List, and Burst List only has 1 element. You can click the drop down and see that that element has some properties to it, but this tells us that there's only a single burst for the smoke. Now let's look at the next one called Flare. In Flare, click on Spawn and notice that the burst list has 3 array elements rather than just 1. Now for the third one, which is labeled 2, click on this drop down to the right and click Delete. Do the same for the second element. Now there's only a single element in the burst list for the Flare. We need to do this for all of these sections that contain 3 elements in their burst list. So next we'll go to Airglow, click on Spawn, and in the burst list we'll remove the third and the second elements. Next, go to the muzzle flame, click spawn, and in the burst list, remove the third and the second elements. Next, click on muzzle flame long, click spawn, and remove the third and the second elements. And if you click on refraction and click spawn, you'll see that it only has 2 elements. We don't need to mess with this one, but the shells definitely need to be altered because we don't want 3 shells to be dropped. So click on shells eject and spawn and remove the third and second element. And now you'll see that we have a single burst with a single bullet shell. This is exactly what we want. Go ahead and click save. And now we can go back to the shooter character BP. And for muzzle flash, we can use our P Bellica muzzle. Now, in order to know which one is which, here in our game assets effects folder, we can rename this. And let's add an underscore and type single underscore burst. It's kind of a long name, but it's descriptive. So now in shooter character BP for muzzle flash, we can simply search for single, and here it is, P Bellica muzzle single burst. Perfect. Compile and save, and now we're ready to test. Click play, and let's fire this a few times. And there we have it. We have the muzzle blast. It's firing at the socket location in the direction that the barrel is pointing, thanks to our socket transform. And we have a bullet shell flying off and bouncing on the floor. Amazing. Okay, this concludes this video. We've done a lot in this video. We added a socket to our skeleton just at the tip of the weapon. We've then used that socket in C++ to get its transform in order to call the gameplay statics function spawn emitter at location using that socket transform. We're calling this function in fire weapon. And then finally, we took the particle system that came with Bellica, which was a 3-shot burst, and we altered each individual component so that it only has a single element in its burst list, which means that only one of those particles are spawned, so we don't have a 3-shot burst effect. We did this on a copy so we didn't mess up the original, and then we saved that in our new folder called effects in our assets folder. We then set the muzzle flash on our blueprint, and now we're able to fire the gun. Excellent job. In the next video, we're going to take care of animating Bellica when we fire the weapon, so we get a little bit of recoil along with the gun blast. We'll see you in the next video.